Welcome to this CASA webinar, part of CASA's Breakthrough series featuring evidence and analysis by the CASA programme and its partners. As those of you who've attended earlier webinars in this series will know, it's designed to showcase solutions to the most common challenges in agribusiness for inclusive growth and to support the facilitation of investment in agriculture in emerging markets. So this webinar explores the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and asks, where are we now? Many of you will know we had a series of webinars in April and May 2020, a year ago, considering the immediate impact of the pandemic. And many messages emerged from those early conversations in the COVID crisis. Food security issues were arising from the difficulties of cross-border trade. The importance of storage and processing in local markets was emphasized as difficulties in transmitting goods were experienced. We saw the importance of resilience being achieved through diversity of supply. So local may not be always the most resilient, but a combination of local and wider regional trade was what was creating resilience. And at the time of the first webinars last year, many investors were trying to support existing portfolio companies to navigate the crisis, rather than looking at new investments. So a year on, what has changed and how are agricultural value chains performing? What are the next challenges on the horizon? We'll hear from three very distinguished speakers in a moment. But just before I turn to them, I just wanted to highlight a couple of housekeeping things. Firstly, you'll be sent a link to a survey at the end of the webinar. If you could please just fill that in to give us an idea of what you'd like to see in these webinars in the future and give us a bit of feedback. And secondly, please do post your questions on the chat and we'll come to those after all of the speakers have finished their remarks. Please post them early as you can, because then we'll make sure we can get to them by the end of the hour. The hour always tends to go rather fast. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Sami Khan, and he is from CDC. Just finding the notes here. So Sami, here we are. Sami leads the Food and Agriculture Strategy at CDC Group. CDC is the UK government's DFI, as many of you will know, with a core geographical focus in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, with assets under management of close to $7 billion. CDC has pioneered DFI investing in Africa and Asia with over 70 years of successful development work. It's one of the largest investors in the African and Indian food and agriculture sectors. Sami has nearly 25 years of experience in the food and agriculture industry in emerging markets in various capacities. His prior roles include Director of Food and Ag at Accenture for Southeast Asia in Singapore, Director of Food and Agriculture Investments at CASA, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Malaysia, Operating Partner at Rabo Equity Advisors, and Head of Food and Agri Research and Advisory at Rabobank Southeast Asia in Singapore. So Sami, after a year, how has the pandemic impacted DFI investment and the performance of the value chains in Africa? And what are the next challenges? What should investors be doing?
Good afternoon, good morning to you all. First of all, thank you, Alice, for the kind introduction, and thank you, CASA, for inviting me to this seminar. And the topic is obviously very pertinent. In terms of what CDC has done to tackle the COVID pandemic, we have had a three-tiered response, focusing on both the issues that you talked about, the resilience and agility. On the resilience side, our focus was on portfolio defense. Our prime focus during the initial period, the first 12 months, was to enhance the liquidity in our portfolio companies to maintain liquidity in the system and ride out the COVID impact. The second response was on basically focusing on strengthening the supply chains or portfolio companies, assist with the smooth running of critical trade flows. Initially, there was quite a lot of disruption to trade flows and supply chains. Things are slowly improving, but we are still not out of the woods. We've seen what happened in the second wave in the case of India, so we cannot let our guard down. The third area of focus was more on the agility part, which is to rebuild and the recovery over the midterm. As you know, in our core geographies, the pandemic led to a much larger food security issue. So we felt that a lot of innovative and bold and non-conventional approaches that will be required to deal with the interim challenges as we move forward. Uh, we, for instance, looked at potential co-investment investment opportunities, partnerships with other DFIs, like-minded investors, in terms of building integrated and scaled agricultural value chains with large smallholder components backed by with offtake or buyback arrangements on the market side with leading multinationals or regional players. The impact has been profound, and some companies are still feeling the impact. As you know, the impact could be defined into a number of areas. One is, of course, the capital allocation, the capital funding. There's certainly been a decline in FDI and finance coming in. There's been a flow of funds outside of the continent, and there's been a decline in remittances. That's what we witnessed in the first couple of months. And on the supply and demand side, we talked about supply chain disruption. We saw the disruption in harvest, and there was obviously a demand shock, which included cutting down of international orders for some of the integrated export-oriented supply chains from Africa. There were also some acts of quote unquote force majeure, such as locust devastation that we saw in East Africa that had a profound effect in countries like Ethiopia and Kenya. There was an oil price collapse. That's obviously much more of a separate issue, but that also led to a problem. Then, of course, there was the policy malaise that not just was seen across Africa, but across a lot of the emerging markets on imposing of ad hoc trade restrictions. So, in terms of the second part of your question, what do we see on the horizon? What are the next challenges on the horizon for DFIs, and what should investors do? So, obviously, there are a couple of things that continue to be the focus for DFIs and impact investors like us. And COVID has just accelerated the focus towards that. One, of course, is food security. We've seen the breakdown in supply chains, and the extensive reliance of imports for a number of sub-Saharan African countries means that we need to do something to develop local supply base, so there's no further disruption in an acute sense, which leads to unaffordability of many staple commodities. Then we, of course, seen currency depreciation in many countries, and it makes it very difficult for countries to import food items and makes it much more costly. We also need to think out of the box when we talk about food security. We also need to talk about inclusivity. So we need to work in ways to develop integrated supply chains which have an inclusive component. Upstream smallholder finance is certainly an issue. Another area that's gained focus is, of course, climate change. Already fragmented supply chains, excessive number of smallholder farmers in Africa mean that any potential climate change impact or floods or heat wave is going to have a devastating impact on the smallholder farmers in particular, who are more vulnerable. So we need to look at new solutions for that. This is where AgTech can come in, new investments in areas such as micro irrigation, which allow increase in yield, but also allow farming to take place in areas which otherwise could only handle one crop cycle because of the excessive dependence on rain-fed agriculture. Last but not least is something related to nutritional adequacy we need to tackle. From an investor perspective, we continue to remain, investors that look at the long-term view, exercising patient capital. We have an internal tool called Catalyst Capital, which is can be observed as being sort of concessional finance, where we take up to 12-year positions when it comes to equity, lower threshold for commercial returns when it's required. Patient capital also means riding the cycle, handling longer inception periods for a number of commercial crops, which take at least 5-6 years minimum to yield commercial returns. We need to address both the hard and soft issues. It's not just about putting capex or processing facilities, logistics, and warehousing, but also allocating capital to training, upskilling, extension service support, and application of AgTech. AgTech is a consistent theme that we'll see being deployed across the board from an investor perspective, because it's going to be transformative. It's going to be a game changer. We obviously need to build up strong data points and then derive meaningful analysis from this, and that can also convert to having sort of requisite credit data points that could be used in SME or smallholder finance. We talked about developing supply chains. We talked about integrated value chains. One of the examples that we see that we are personally quite excited about in the long term is the development and support of agri-industrial parks, which have an integrated upstream component and agri-hinterland featuring smallholder farmers, linked to value-added processing, linked to downstream market channels and or offtake agreements, working with multinationals or regional champions. So it's in essence, it'll be a live and functioning integrated value chain. So I'll leave it at this point. Thank you.
Sami, thank you very much indeed. That was really, really helpful. And just a quick follow-on question to you on that. Some of the things that you were mentioning are accelerations of things that were already happening, and some are kind of new because of COVID. Would you say there were new priorities that have emerged because of COVID, or new approaches that have accelerated further and faster than you had thought, or is it a continuation of the same but just with greater intensity?
I would say it's greater intensity and on what are already defined as the core challenges that DFI communities facing: food security, climate change, nutrition adequacy, but a sense of urgency. For instance, making sure that local supply chains are adequate to support domestic demand, keep food supply moving smoothly, affordability, things of the sort in the event future trade disruptions take place. And of course, it has also accelerated and amplified the potential role of AgTech in providing a sort of market building mechanism, and also addressing some of the structural market issues and creating equitability in the system, especially for the SMEs and smallholder farmers.
Perfect. And the investments that you and others are doing are both in the farmers themselves, but perhaps as important in those agro-processing facilities, in other parts of the supply chain, in the ag-tech enablers. Would you say that investment has to happen across all of those different parts of the chain?
Yes, absolutely. It has to be a full value chain approach. It has to be a holistic approach. As they say, the whole idea is to have the whole be greater than the sum of its parts. And it's a long journey. It'll be requiring a number of multiple stakeholders from both the private sector, DFIs, commercial lenders, and most importantly, the smallholder farmers and SMEs.
Fantastic, thank you very much, and really interesting that the COVID has sort of made this more intensified alongside the sort of climate and food security issues. It's sort of brought things even more to the fore, the need for that resilience and that agility that you mentioned. Wonderful. So thank you very much, Sami. We'll come back to you with questions. Please do post your questions. I see there are a couple of questions on the chat already, and that's great. We'll come back to your wider questions when we come to the Q&A at the end. I'd like now to pass on to Philip Boahen, who is the Chief Agriculture Policy Economist, Departure of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank. He leads the bank's interventions on food and nutrition security policy, including Feed Africa response to COVID-19. He's the coordinator of the bank's portfolio under the Global Agriculture and Food Security Programme. He began his career with the German organization GIZ as agriculture expert and advisor. He then joined USAID, Trade and Investment Programme in Ghana before joining the African Development Bank in 2007. Philip, we look forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice, and good afternoon and good morning to colleagues joining us. Let me associate myself with most of the comments made by Sami with respect to the challenges that African countries and African farmers faced when the COVID pandemic started. He did mention about the locust infestation that plagued parts of East Africa. I just like to add, before the locust, the bank was at the forefront fighting fall armyworm. As you're aware, fall armyworm can consume up to 80% of crop yield. So this was an already difficult situation for us before the locust invasion and then the pandemic. The pandemic affected every single farmer trying to access input from wherever that they access the input from one country to the other to ensure that you're able to move seeds and fertilizer across. This was heavily impacted. The situation was even worse for landlocked countries such as Zambia, Malawi, that depended on other ports. So if the port of Durban is closed, it was practically impossible to move fertilizer seeds to these specific areas for farmers to have access to them. And so it required that the bank responded in a way that would provide some relief to our regional member countries, but more importantly, build resilience now and into the future. The starting point was a big program that the bank initiated. It was called the COVID Relief Facility. And that provided a $10 billion facility for African countries. But the primary focus at that time was to address the health issues for countries to buy ventilators and so hand sanitizers and all that. What we did in the Department of Agriculture and Agro-Industry was to have a laser-focused approach in addressing food systems. And that is where we prepared a whole package to deal with the impact of COVID-19 on food systems. And this facility had 8 main operational priority areas. A little bit of a shift from the traditional Feed Africa approach, which overall is to help African countries build resilience and reverse importation. But it required that we retweak this a little bit in response to the impact of COVID-19 on food systems. So there are areas where we had to provide direct support to stabilize food prices that went through other instruments such as sector budget support, so countries can have resources to be able to import and also to address immediate food challenges. It also meant that we look more at other support services that will help countries deliver more extension through different methods. Digital agriculture became a very instrumental aspect of our work, which, I mean, hitherto was not given the prominence that it deserved for our extension and to also ensure that farmers are part of the food system. And we also try to promote localized food production with government and to ensure that policy, environment, and regional initiatives were supported. So under the FARC, we ended up restructuring our portfolio to make sure that the existing operations freed resources to address some of these priority areas, which were very urgent at that time. And in addition to that, we sought co-financing with other partners. The likes of AGRA, IFAD, World Bank came on board to provide the targeted support that countries needed at that time. Remember, we supported each country to put in place a food security response plan. And most of these partners contributed to financing this particular response plan. And we also attracted additional funding under the Global Agricultural Food Security Initiative. Overall, the bank assisted so far from last year up to now over $1.2 billion worth of resources for various programs addressing these priority areas. Africa is countries are already suffering in terms of the fiscal space that has been squeezed as a result of COVID. So any financing that we can pull to support the development of food system is really, really welcome really for most of these countries. But going forward, the bank intends to reinforce most of these areas that we have put in the priority areas. More importantly, and just to reinforce the point that Sami made, there is a need to focus more on building integrated agriculture value chains. What COVID-19 taught us, for example, maize, soybean, rice, which are the basic staples, is not only for human consumption, but it's also an input as animal feed. So we find ourselves, humans and chickens, fighting over maize and soybean. So it meant that we needed to build a robust system that improve productivity, that expand area under production, and that deploy the right technologies, the proven technologies, to ensure that we grow enough food, not just for human consumption, but also for these other allied, value chains. So building an integrated value chain is the focus now for the bank, and also to provide policy support. But more importantly, we want to work more with private sector. One lesson that we have learned is that where governments fail, private sector fill in the void, especially in most of these food systems. And so the bank is trying to put in place more innovative financing instruments. We've started piloting some in some countries. We call it the missing middle financing vehicle. And we complement that with a risk sharing facility. But we have also realized that crop insurance has become critical. This is one of the lessons that COVID-19 taught us. And so this will be a package that has to be out there for private sector actors to take advantage of. And we also do recognize that policy support and facilitation is critical. So the bank is going to focus more on these aspects. As I said, these are some of the things we were doing earlier, but COVID has now made us readjust and then repackage and then focus more on these operational priority areas.
Philip, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Really insightful. And I wondered, one of the areas that I saw you were working on was stabilization of food prices. And I wonder if you could just touch on what interventions have been done in that area. It's an interesting area in relation particularly to what the private sector might how they might invest if food prices need to be stabilized and there's interventions to do that. I wondered if you could give us any examples of how that's worked in the last year since COVID struck.
So let me give an example from two countries. One is Ghana. So under the COVID response facility that we put in place, we supported government to provide financing for private sector to set up mechanization service centers. And I must say that some of these mechanization service centers existed before, but they received additional support to expand. And as a result, we're able to do more land development and expand more area under production, under conservation agriculture. It's important to facilitate the private sector to have access to no-till planters, harvesters, all these. So the financing vehicle was something that needed to be created for private sector. Second was input delivery. The cost of input impacted much more on the output price. Where farmers are able to organize, where you have medium to large-scale commercial farmers able to organize to assess input in bulk, it impacts overall on the output price. So with all this support and the productivity enhancing technologies that we put in place, maize, for example, moved from average of 2.5 tons per hectare to 4.5 tons per hectare. It made it easier for these medium-scale commercial farmers to be able to really sell at a price that was not, and I must say that it has become such a successful program that the government is actually seeking to expand it further, because through that program, they're able to have enough for the school feeding program as well. So as we speak, 8,000 hectares of maize, soybean, rice are already under production, and the government intends to expand it. You go to Zambia, similar initiatives are being undertaken. So these are some of the measures we put in place to ensure that we don't only bring private sector investment, but also ensure that the output price is more or less mitigated.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And I see there's a couple of really good questions coming through on the chat. One about the importance of industrial parks and agro-processing, and one around the extension services. And we'll come back to both of those at the Q&A at the end, because I want to pose that to all three panelists. Please do keep posing your questions. We will come to those at the end. But Philip, thank you very much for that set of remarks. And we'll move on to our final panelist, Sheila Mugyenzi. Sheila is the Director of Investment Promotion and Development at the Uganda Investment Authority. The Uganda Investment Authority's strategic objectives include reducing the cost of doing business, strengthening the private sector capacity to drive growth and create jobs, and strengthening the enabling investment environment. Sheila has 20 years experience in investment promotion. She became the director responsible for investment promotion and facilitation and in charge of the aftercare teams. And she's developed Uganda's strategy for targeting strategic investors. So Sheila, have you seen the pandemic affecting agriculture? How have you seen that happening in Uganda? And what are the implications that you see for investors where you are?
Okay, thank you very much, Alice, and also CASA for this opportunity to engage with a vast audience on these important issues in agriculture. It was very interesting to hear Sami and Philip. And I won't repeat, of course, the obvious disruptions that took place within the economies, especially in agriculture. But probably, Alice, you asked about Uganda, so I'll just tell you about some few interesting, impacts that happened. Definitely, we had an institution of curfews, people couldn't move. So it did lead to a decline in effective demand for food because the schools were closed, hotels were closed, and also household incomes reduced because quite a number of people are in agriculture. But it was interesting to see that because of movement, it was actually the transporting of agricultural produce that was affected, but not the production of food. So we're seeing a lot of news where there was a lot of glut, a lot of production, and farmers could not reach the markets, as Sami actually put it quite elaborately about movement of products. But during the time of restrictions, the government of Uganda facilitated the movement of cargo in and out of the country. So about twice a week or thrice as the restrictions eased, were able to move cargo. And surprisingly, according to information from our Ministry of Trade, Uganda earned significantly from exports, and 42% of those exports were actually export earnings from agriculture. So this helped bring some sense of stability to the economy, not much, but we had interesting, news that at the height of the pandemic, Uganda displaced India as a #1 supplier on the Italian market for coffee between April and December, that coffee period. But even if some commodities were impacted negatively, we see like the maize was impacted negatively. We do export maize to our neighbors, Sudan and the DRC, and now we couldn't export the maize. So there were some negative impacts on some products. And we have a vast number of commodities that I won't go into right now. But most of these products are produced by smallholder farms who make up about 68% of our population in Uganda, which is about 40 million. So you can imagine the impact of the restriction on the movement and the border challenges. So prices fell. So even if I said that exports increased, there were falling prices globally, nationally, regionally. So in those circumstances where our produce has even little value, Philip talked about value addition and integrated value addition, but we export most of the commodities raw, so we do get low prices for that. But I just want to say briefly that the pandemic restrictions enabled also a birth of some innovations and new ideas. For instance, enterprises now are able to digitize and resort to online marketing, for instance, online deliveries. Even here at the UIA, which is the investment promotion agency for the country, we also considered online facilitation. We are developing a national SME portal platform for SMEs and smallholder farmers so that we can be able to facilitate the linkages and engagements online. So that's one of the, positive, I would say, impacts of COVID. And we had an interesting impact also. Farmers diversified. Those who are depending on cash crops, for instance, diversified in what had high demand during the COVID time, went into things like apiculture, horticulture, and we got more investors going into the agricultural space, even investors in other sectors who have diversified, because we see them entering our industrial parks to do agro-processing projects. And I think it was Philip who mentioned that inputs could no longer come into the country. So importers and processors had to resort to diversifying their sources of imports by seeking alternative, affordable sources, which is difficult in, and this is where I wanted to bring in the issue of legislation, because in countries probably that have good legislation on biotechnology and new technologies are able to support the production of inputs. Now, if a landlocked country, an African country, does not have the legislation that supports the development of these technologies, then you're hard pressed. But we had good news that we are about to pass our biotechnology bill, hopefully. And because, the impact was seen. If we had internal or national sources of inputs, then we would not suffer much when we had this lockdown. So there were some negative impacts, definitely, but the pandemic and the being closed didn't open our eyes to some of these opportunities. Probably I'll first leave it there so that I don't surpass my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Well, really useful remarks. Thank you so much. And interesting that this highlighted the need to have much more of an integrated value chain within the country. Was that already something that you were aware of wanting to support, or did it just accelerated that need, or identified a new need, would you say, in that area?
No, it did actually accelerate the need, because already in our national development plan and in the plans for the strategic plans for the Ministry of Agriculture, the value addition and integrated value addition, the development of clusters are really a focus of government. But probably now the priority focus in agriculture after the pandemic is to make sure that the agricultural products are competitive on the national and regional and continental market. Of course, we know that the African Continental Free Trade Area is about to be implemented. So we need to be sure, we need to be ready to ensure that the products are also competitive on the market, which brings in the issue of certification of products, regulation. So those are right now the urgent focus to ensure that the products are competitive on the continental and global market. There's an urgency right now to look into the new technologies of farming, storage, and packaging, because we do have problems with post-harvest, handling, pest control, disease control. So those are the major focuses right now, even for investors in the private sector are looking to those areas so that the products are more competitive on the market. So we're seeing that there's even an urgent need for more research. The government has to invest in more research. We're seeing private entities venturing into the research also, better varieties and resistant varieties. So there's an urgent need to understand and address all these issues behind the issues that lead to low productivity, really, and diseases. So that's the kind of focus. And of course, the focus that Sami and Philip talked about, looking into the financial services spectrum. What is relevant to the smallholder farmers, people in agriculture. So there's also a focus into looking at the financial solutions in the market for agriculture. Those are some of the focus.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you. No, that's great. And I wanted to move to some of the questions that have been posted online. I mean, one is very related to your recent comments, Sheila, from Aditi around the people adjusting quite quickly and innovating into the space, and we wanting to find out whether there are early lessons to ensure that that's supported into the future. I mean, perhaps Sami, coming back to you, and why don't all of the panelists put your videos on, and we can have a bit of a discussion now. But with the innovations that you've seen, both on the ag tech and on just smallholder farmers diversifying, as you were mentioning, Sheila, or other innovations that sort of have been a positive, have taken you by surprise. Sami, coming to you first, have you seen that diversification, that agility more than you expected, and what's taken you by surprise in that COVID year?
It's a good question. I think we're still learning as we go, because we're still, as we talked about earlier, not out of the woods. What I've seen is, in at least in the case of some of our portfolio companies, they have resorted to very interesting and innovative approaches, and a lot of that is obviously, as we talked about earlier, accelerated because of the challenges they faced with COVID. And we supported our companies through what we call CDC Plus, which you're quite familiar with, and is an internal technical assistance facility for them to potentially deploy some sort of pilots where they could look at upskilling or training their staff, as well as EdTech. So I see that there's this sort of a directional shift. Is still early going. I think a lot more can be done, is deploying various tools from EdTech platforms to help and assist, especially on the upstream side. At this stage, there's some access to basic facilities that have been made through mobile services, through SMS. But I think the next challenge will be to take it one level further, where in the future there will be an opportunity to build up a sort of a predictive analytics component, which will act as a sort of a surrogate for farmers to help them take decisions, whether in terms of when to plant, where to plant, when to harvest, prevent disease before it really hits the crop and devastates not just the farms, but the incomes of their families. The other thing, of course, I would like to see, and I think this is still work in process, is a lot more work on agro-industrial parks. And I think there was a question in the box. If you don't mind, I would like to address that as well. One successful example that we have seen is a particular agro-industrial park in Ethiopia, which we are working on with a multinational company. And I cannot give the details of the company at this stage because the deal is still work in progress. But what the Ethiopian authorities have done, and this of course predates COVID, is create a sort of a one-stop shop at the government level, the Agri Transformation Authority, to create not just a agri-industrial park, but quote unquote, they actually call it an integrated agri-industrial park. And that allows for the facilitation, as we talked about earlier, of producing products of the right quality, of the right grade, of the right volumes on a consistent basis. And what we need to also see is a lot of the local companies getting involved more in the work related to upstream seed development, or piloting new innovative initiatives and technologies that can guarantee sort of longer yields to address the climate equation as well, to address some of the soil fertility issues, the nutrient balance issues. And in this case, for this company that we are working in Ethiopia, they actually sent down a team 4 or 5 years even before putting their investment together to experiment with the soil, to experiment with different varieties of seeds and work with local farmers so that everybody's on the same page when they do move from proof of concept to scale up. So it's also very important to have a sequence approach to investments. We need to really make sure that there's an established proof of concept. And I think the point that Sheila raised is so important. Is all about global competitiveness. If we have a sequence approach, we can have global competitiveness, because most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a natural endowment second to none. So if we can achieve that cost competitiveness through technology, through integrated value chains, it'll be incredible multiplier impact on society.
Thank you very much, Sami. And Philip, coming to you, perhaps follow up on that question around the agri-processing zones, the parks, because I know AFDB has also done work in that area. Has that been something that we know that the COVID crisis has highlighted the need for more processing capacity? Is that something that you can just comment on, and the work that you're doing in that area too, please?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for the question. One of the priority areas was to support processing capacity of our various countries, especially processing of nutritious foods, and so it's been an area that the bank has prioritized and actually pushing strongly. We were doing some works in the agro-processing zones before the COVID came, but I think COVID has really accelerated this aspect. And when I talk about an integrated agriculture value chain, this is an example of an integrated agriculture value chain. We are not just interested in putting white elephants somewhere, building industrial parks for the sake of having an infrastructure. We're talking about a whole production ecosystem that feed this particular industrial parks, and that process high quality and nutritious food that goes to the market, and so on and so forth. And we view this as an opportunity to involve women and youth to have sustainable jobs within this ecosystem. So this year alone, the bank has accelerated works in Nigeria. I think the team came from Appraisal Mission to develop one agro-processing zone in Nigeria. The one in Liberia is also under processing, but at a relatively early stage in development. We also do have some work in Tanzania and Sierra Leone. These are either at feasibility or pre-appraisal stage. As you are aware, Alice, the bank provides financial and technical capacity for government to design these projects with private sector. And for agro-industrial zone to be successful, you need an anchor investor that will manage and run these operations successfully. And when we do that, we are able to crowd in other private sector players to establish the kind of integrated agriculture value chain that we all want to see.
Do you think, just following on that, do you think that means, and it picks up a question that we got from Mansour Ahmed, do you think it means that it's likely to be in quite high volume transport areas? So where his question was, for smallholder farmers, industrial parks are often nearer to transport hubs rather than nearer to them. And I wonder whether that is a danger, particularly if we have to have a sort of large private sector anchor investor within those. Does that mean that smallholders are perhaps less well served by those, or how would you characterize that?
Okay, so I think we have interchanged agro-processing zone with industrial parks. So where possible, we have a multi-facility economic zone where you have a variety of activities going on. Ethiopia is one model, but in other countries, different models apply. And what the bank is seeking to push forward under the Feed Africa strategy is more of agro-processing zones. So these are agri-related, and the processing facilities or the industrial parks or processing zones are located within the areas where production is taking place. Obviously, government needs to provide other infrastructure such as road, power supply, and then water facilities. So it takes a bit of time to negotiate all these aspects too. But the idea is to ensure that you don't grow maize in part A of the country, only to have 20 trucks moving 100 tons of maize to part B over a period of 3-4 days, and so on and so forth. It's to bring the industrial park closer to the production area. Ghana has done it differently. Ghana starts by developing the production zone and then bringing the industrial park later on. So they started a pilot of maize, soya, and rice production of 1,000 hectares. They've now reached 8,000. They hope to move to 20,000 within a particular area. And in 2022, they intend to start an agro-processing zone in that area. And by that time, they would have had critical mass of inputs to feed the factory and to ensure that they process enough, not just for domestic market, but also for regional market.
Fantastic, thank you. That's great. And just moving on to another area of questioning, Sheila, wanting to ask you, so Tenjo Okwen has asked about how services such as agricultural extension, microfinance and project monitoring might have had to change in order to continue to be relevant in terms of in times of COVID-like challenges. And I wondered if you'd seen that and how you have adapted to that challenge in Uganda. How might those services need to be remodeled given those challenges?
Okay, for the extension services, I mean, it's just to accelerate their reach to the smallholder farms. But what we are seeing that has been changed because of the pandemic is really the mode of access for finance for the SMEs and smallholder farmers. Of course, in place, government has development financing focused in the key priority sectors already for primary agriculture, agro-processing and manufacturing. So you have development financing, and 80% of it makes up that kind of portfolio. And at the central bank, if I remember, in financing, there is an agricultural credit facility that is run by the central bank. And but what has come to the fore in this pandemic time is that there's a need to lower the interest rates that we even think are low. Right now, for the agricultural credit facility, the interest rate is 12%, which is the lowest, and yet we know that in other countries, it can even be lower. So there's a need to really lower the interest rates and also focus on more patient financing. And I remember Sami mentioned something like that. But we are also seeing a growth in fintech right now, just like in the rest of the world. Uganda is also developing in that area despite the interconnectivity challenges. But there have been innovations that have been created around new models of payments for the farmers through mobile money through because the financial sector has also diversified into that area of paying through mobile money. I think we have about 23 million who are able to access mobile money. So we are seeing an acceleration of focus into those financial services, but the major challenge that we are seeing, even as we digitize the financial services, even as we try to digitize some of the services to reach the farmers, because we have some private investors who have sort of created solutions that can be able to reach these services to the farmers through their mobile phones. And because some of them maybe don't have access to the internet, but they've developed apps that can be able to share with the farmers that maybe this and this input or service is ready at this center, and they're able to go there, or they're able to pay by mobile money and have these delivered to them. So these are some of the innovations that we are seeing when it comes to extending services and payments. But of course, we still do have a challenge of connectivity to fully digitize some of these services.
Great, thanks, Sheila. And moving on to a question from Patience Jindong, coming perhaps first to Philip. Question being, I think facilitating trade transactions, especially regional trade, will help increase farmers' income and a better way of empowering them. Using technologies that ensure consumer trust will help smallholders get a premium price for their produce. And I know that's something you mentioned, Sheila, in terms of the certification work that you're doing. Philip, work that AFDB is doing in that area, sort of on the back of COVID, being a catalyst for more thinking about the trade and so on. What would you add there, Philip, on what technologies are ensuring consumers trust to help smallholders get a premium price for their products when they trade?
Yeah, actually, regional trade and especially agricultural trade has been a big issue for us in the past and continues to be a big issue now. Our efforts have been in area of harmonizing regional trade policies, especially agricultural trade, to ensure that you have goods and services move much freer. The experience we had in 2018, 2019, when we were trying to address fall armyworm issues, was that you have fall armyworm in country A. Country B has the chemicals that can be used to fight fall armyworm, but for some reason it's so difficult to move it across the border, and that creates opportunity for people to bring in fake chemicals because farmers are desperate. Farmers want solutions to address the pest and so on and so forth. The second challenge we were facing was fake seeds. You know, you have people bagging grains and then saying that this is coming from this country and so on and so forth. So these are the challenges that we have been facing in the past, and we are focusing more on our efforts on IT platforms at the borders to ensure that once, and it's a long project. We've started with COMESA and we are expanding to West Africa and so on and so forth. What we're trying to do is to get to a point where at the border, when there is seeds coming from country A to country B, just with a barcode, you can verify the authenticity of these seeds and it can move quickly to facilitate trade and for farmers to have value for money. When it's chemical, it's the same thing. So it's going to take us a bit of time. COVID has helped us realize there is a need to fast track, this sort of interaction. And I'm happy to note that under the AU, we have a task force addressing some of these issues. ECOWAS has come up with a strong messaging on this, and there is a task force to address most of these issues. So the bank provides support, technical and financial, to make sure that we are able to address some of these specific policies.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I think we have time for one last question, which I will ask Sami. It was one of the first questions that was posted, and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit around a question raised by Fode Kaba. We've seen the role played by the African diaspora to support the economic development of the continent. What plan do we have to get the diaspora invest in agriculture? I'm going to broaden that out, I think, in a question. Are you seeing post-COVID a different pattern of investment, and do you think the diaspora will be a source of that co-investment going forward? And where else do you see new investors coming forward as a result of COVID, or ones sadly moving away as a result of COVID? Sami, can I start with you, and if we have time, move on to others?
Yes, as a result of COVID, there has been a lot more interest on new impact investors looking for potential co-investments, given the remit at their corporate levels. There's a lot more focus on going beyond just ESG, but doing good in a much more sustainable way. And I think a lot of that, to some extent, has been facilitated and encouraged by, I would assume, the African diaspora and some of the other multilateral development banks, such as the AFDB, of course. I think we are still, Africa, as you know, especially in the food and agriculture sector, is still facing a dearth of capital. And I think whatever can be done to facilitate more transactions, getting more pension funds, more endowment funds, that journey still continues. If you look at any sector or any continent which could really do with a broadening of the sort of investment products and profiles, and like both Sheila and Philip were talking about earlier, about maybe having sort of different investors with different risk return appetites coming in the form of blended finance. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and COVID has just put the sort of the focus on this, but this journey needs to continue.
Absolutely. Well, and sadly, I would love to come to Philip and Sheila, but I think we have run out of time, and apologies for that. But it's been great to get all of your insights, and I think that's what CASA is about, to try and see where new investment could come through. So we are designed to understand where new sources of investment for smallholders and wider agribusiness can happen. I think some of the things that you are highlighting, all three of you today, around the importance of the agricultural technologies, investment in that, the importance of investment in agro-processing, the importance of investment in the sort of climate diversification and agility of the farmers to grow enough food, not just for themselves, but also for the animals that they depend on as well. And production of the food isn't always the issue, it's the transportation, so the importance of supporting that logistics, as we learned from the lessons of COVID. All of those things open up opportunities for investment, which perhaps we just have more transparent to us in the wake of the COVID crisis, and well, in the midst of the COVID crisis, perhaps I should say. And none of us know quite how that will evolve, but it was good to hear some positives coming out about how some of those trends are accelerating as a result of what we've been seeing in COVID. So many thanks to all three of you for some really excellent remarks and for your insights. That's all for this session. Then the next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 26th of May. So please do join us if you can at 12 noon as usual, and please complete the feedback form on this webinar so we can continue to improve. Thank you to all of your good questions, and we hope that you'll engage again next month on the next session. And please do, if you want to go back to this will be on the CASA website if you want to hear the recording and hear it all again, all of the insightful comments that our speakers have made. Many thanks to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again.